From the City of Rancho Mirage Community Cultural Commission and Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory, this is Curiosity Trap, the show about the fascinating subjects, people, and institutions that spark a special interest in our audience. We explore things you've always been curious about by going deep with experts and icons that represent our collective cultures and connect our diverse community. Get ready to get trapped in a world of discovery and insight available nowhere else. I'm TJ Hicks, and on today's show, we sit down for a discussion with United States Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden.
Librarianship was really an adventure for me to find out that there is a profession that was dedicated to making books and reading and knowledge available to people, and that just seemed ideal. The confirmation process was really an eye-opener for me in so many ways because I got to meet legislators that were committed to not only the nation's history, but making information available. And that was just a wonderful thing that made me very pleased that I was confirmed. Well, my vision for this library is very simple, that people will realize that they have a national treasure and that it is part of their heritage, and everyone can find something in the Library of Congress, produced by the Library of Congress, that relates to their lives or where they want to go. What I hope to accomplish with the dedicated staff of the library in the next 10 years of the appointment is to really make more of the collections accessible in various formats. And if we can say that we have collections in the next 10 years that have never been seen digitally and that are used and that are tied in with curriculums around the country, and that people are going to, at the end of 10 years, if people are thinking of the Library of Congress as a go-to place in the stratosphere, really, for information and resources, that I think would be quite an accomplishment.
Tell us about your childhood. Tell us about that little girl under the piano.
The little girl under the piano grew up listening to music because my parents were classically trained musicians. Violin, strings, my dad, and my mom piano. So that's why I was under the piano while they were practicing. And at first it was just little toys, and then it was books. So I grew up thinking of words with music in the background, and that I think has carried over.
Did you ever think about going into the music profession or going that direction?
Because I grew up hearing people who were super talented, I knew, and we all agreed by the time I was 12, that I was not one of those people. And so, but what I found and there was no judgment, you could imagine musical families and things, but what I found was that I was able to hear or voices when I looked at text. And so I knew that words were more of my manuscript and my way of communicating. And
then you grew up in both New York and Chicago, is that right?
New York. My family's from Illinois, okay. Middle Illinois, Champaign, Illinois, where the university is, Springfield, where the capital is. And then when we got fancy, we'd go up to Chicago. So I spent time there, and my dad was a musician, as I mentioned, and he went to New York to be in a jazz environment. And so that's how we got to New York.
So tell us a little bit about how you got into the librarian career path, because I know you've called yourself an accidental librarian. What do you mean by that?
And it's a very appropriate title, and I've claimed it now. And people say, wait a minute, didn't you want to be a librarian all of your life? Because you spent most of your adult life in the library field. And I had to say no, even though I loved books and words and libraries growing up and all through my young adulthood, I never really thought about, as many people might not think about, how libraries work. Who selects the books? Who designed the building? I just love libraries. And so when I graduated from undergrad, wondering what I was going to do, go to grad school, everything, I was encouraged by my mom to seek employment while I figured it all out. And between job interviews, I was a history major in political science. Between job interviews, I would go to my favorite place, the Central Library in Chicago. And I was there, and someone who had just graduated with me saw me and thought I was there for the library jobs, because as he said, they're hiring anybody, but he meant that they're hiring people with bachelor's degrees. Mm-hmm. And we do that now in the library profession, try to get people in, see how the profession works. And that's how I discovered, oh, wow, this is wonderful. And so it combined so many things for me.
Well, I can really relate to that, because I was one of those kids who just didn't know which direction I was going to go into. And I ended up in a library. I don't have a library science background like you do, but that's kind of special about today's libraries, right? Is we do all kinds of things, programming and everything else. So. And
there's so many people now that are interested in libraries because of the digital component, the archiving, we're preservation, conservation, the outreach that we're doing. So we're attracting a new group of people, young and young at heart, who say, hey, knowledge is power. We want to make sure that we connect people. And so it's a good time to introduce people to the field.
I know you started out then working in the children's department. Is that right?
Oh, and yes.
So, in your Chicago Public Library system, I know you've sent a tweet recently that said, once a children's librarian, always a children's librarian.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about the impact that's had on your career, and then some of the things that you're doing now at the Library of Congress when it comes to children's literature?
Well, when I was first assigned a position as a library associate at Chicago, I was assigned with a young lady who was in graduate library school. And she wore jeans, and she was having story time for children with autism. She was doing all this really cool stuff in a storefront branch on the south side of Chicago in a pretty challenged neighborhood. And I got a chance to really see what it meant for the young people there. And it took me back to my childhood in New York with PS 96 and a branch library storefront right across the street, and how much that meant to me. So I really gravitated toward being in the children's services area, because I knew what it meant to me personally, and I could see what it meant in this other branch library years later. And so at the Library of Congress, the world's largest library, there is a section called the Young Readers Center. And it was developed to have a place that people that were under 16 could go. And so now we're turning that into, the tentative title right now and working title is a learning lab for the young and the young at heart, to connect them more with our collections.
What?
Yeah, I've got a job. And guess what? I like it, because I'm a librarian. No, I don't want to work anywhere else.
Show Dr. Hayden that. Dr. Hayden, you pick it. That's it.
Oh, okay, good.
Ashe, Ashe, Funda, Alafea, Ashe, Ashe.
I need a hug or two. I need a hug.
Go hug her, everyone. Go hug her.
And we have been adapting to the different things that are going on now with the pandemic, and how much hands-on and touching you'll be able to do. Sure. But we really want to make sure that young people come to the Library of Congress and have the opportunity to become researchers, get excited about some of the collections, and just really connect. We have the world's largest collection of comic books. We have Harry Houdini's collection. We have some really cool. I know you reacted to Harry Houdini.
Well, yeah, just to think that you have his collection of just his things that he actually had
it
is
starts from when he was a young man, and we had one of the first items that we have of his was when he was about 15, and he wrote a letter to his mother saying he was going off to be in basically showbiz. And we have scrapbooks, we have all of his things, even some of the writings, and these are wonderful things similar to what the Carl Sagan collection. And I know with Rancho Mirage and the telescope and your space aspect that the Carl Sagan papers, we have his 12-year-old rendition in his own hand of what space travel would look like in a spacesuit. So these types of things we're trying to digitize and connect them to young people because they are really something. Leonard Bernstein's report card that a group of young people who visited from Baltimore were so excited about because he got C's and D's. And they thought that was really something because here's this famous person that they're learning about, but he had a few times that they could relate to.
It's always good as a kid to know that everyone has their own journey,
And that's what we want to also emphasize. So showing these types of things to young people inspires them and lets them know that it is a journey.
You were at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago for a while, is that right?
Wonderful. Yeah, that was a really wonderful experience that actually has given me even more of an appreciation for the Library of Congress and the mix of materials and the historic part of it, the collection of Orville and Wilbur Wright that's here, and Alexander Graham Bell. So there's a real strong science component here. At the Science and Industry in Chicago, I was involved with developing a public library extension of their museum library for their curators. And so that was a really interesting and fun part because you had people who were coming in to see exhibits and things and then wanted to learn more about things, and you had a library there.
So it really must have brought your two background, or the library part of your background and the museum end of things comes together with the Library of Congress in a way.
It sure does.
But then you taught for a while at University of Pittsburgh.
I taught at the University of Pittsburgh. I taught library science. And ironically now, as we all deal with technology and these different things, it's hard to believe, and some of my colleagues smile, and they might snicker, that one of the courses I taught, this was in the 80s, was Introduction to Microcomputers. And there's a snicker going on right now, in fact, with my colleagues that are with me now. We taught it on Apple IIe's. Mm-hmm. That elicited a grunt from my colleagues. But think about it, how far we've come since it was like 1987. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in library school. And we had our computer classes. We learned basic coding, and we would have to alphabetize a list of names, our class names, take it to the campus computing center, and come back in about 4 hours to see our printout. But that's what it was like. And so here we are today.
And that wasn't that long ago either. So it's amazing.
It wasn't that long ago, and it just shows you how much technology is just accelerating. What took 10 or 15 years, 30, 50 years ago or 40 years ago now takes maybe a month.
And I want to talk a little bit about some of those things that you're doing at the Library of Congress, but I also want to hear a bit more about your career. So you were then the chief librarian in Chicago. You went back to Chicago and became the chief librarian.
Right, after being told by several of my students in Pittsburgh that they were sometimes disillusioned when they entered the workforce, because we really pumped them up with knowledge is power and get out there and you do this. And then they would enter the work area and they weren't able to act on some of the things that we had been teaching them. And the opportunity came to go back to Chicago Public to be the first deputy commissioner / chief librarian. And I thought you should put your money where your mouth is in terms of teaching. You should actually get back into the field. And so that's how that happened, to go back into it and be in administration.
And then you moved on to Baltimore. And
Yes.
I think you spent over 20 years at the Enoch
Yes.
Pratt Library in Baltimore.
Pratt Free Library, and I had learned about it, taught about it in library school.
Oh, really?
Because it's the first library system in the United States. Mr. Pratt was Mr. Andrew Carnegie, who's credited with the public library system in the United States. But at first, when he was trying to give his gifts to municipalities, he was meeting some resistance. And he heard about this gentleman in Baltimore, Maryland, Mr. Enoch Pratt, who had a very successful time giving a gift to the city. And what he found out, he actually came and went and made a trip to Baltimore to see Mr. Pratt. And he found that the key was you make the municipality, if they accept the gift of a library, that they had to pledge that they would support it with public funds. So it was one of the first public-private partnerships. And in Andrew Carnegie's treatise on philanthropy, he talks about Enoch Pratt and the establishment of that library as an example. So I knew about it. I didn't know as much about the city of Baltimore or even the state of Maryland, but I knew about the Pratt Library. And so that was an opportunity to really, because over time, the Pratt Library had become the state library for Maryland as well because of the resources that it had. So it was a combination of a state library and a city library.
It's quite a few branches, right? It
Quite a few
covers the whole
branches
city.
and that state responsibility of the whole transportation of materials between the 23 counties, all of that. So it looked like a UPS thing with the trucks going out and the bins and this and going down or going up to Carroll County or going down to Prince George's County and all of that. So it was a good experience because it meant so much, this network of libraries that they call Maryland Library Heaven.
Oh, huh.
Because of that. You can use your card in the 23 systems, in any of the library systems, and the materials will be returned back, and they work together quite a bit.
Nice. What are some of your most special memories or things that you're most proud of that you accomplished during your time there in Baltimore?
There are a number of things because I was there for, and I still live in the city actually, and commute over. Being part of a group that developed the first network, it was called Seymour, in fact, for Maryland, and the Pratt Library was the hub of that. And it was the first internet network, one of the first in the country, and one of the first Gates Foundation grants to give that. And so we were able to really be at the front of the line with offering the internet services. And also some of the homework centers that we developed, worked with some great people, the young adult services, young lady, Deborah Taylor, who's a legend at Young Adult Services. So a lot of things that the public programming that we were able to do, a lady that's named Judy Cooper, who's legendary, but the author programs we were able to bring in as well. So right now, the Pratt Library and Maryland is on the book tours that will start again. Author tours, they know that they can come to Baltimore and to Maryland and get good programming. Prince George's County is doing a lot of it now.
That's dear to my heart, doing all the programming here in Rancho Mirage. So.
I know. Well, your book festival is
yeah,
marvelous.
we're so lucky to have that here in our community. And obviously having you here for that this past January was wonderful. So one of the things that I know you got some attention for was back in 2016 when there was a lot of strife with the Freddie Gray issue going on and the protests right in the area of your central library there. And things were closing down, is that right? And
well, it was a branch library.
Oh, was it? Okay.
That was at the corner, the epicenter of what people saw all over the world with the drugstore that was on fire and all that. The library, that branch library, is a community center, had been, and so when the unrest happened and so many things were closed, the decision was made to keep the library open, and it remained a community center. It was the only thing that was open, and then within a week or two, it was the place that food was being distributed, supplies, the media had headquarters there. It was the place. And so we were very pleased. It's similar to what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. And Scott Bonner had only been on the job as a director for 3 weeks when Ferguson happened. 3 weeks. But he made the decision to be that community center as well. And they started having classes there and everything.
What kind of role do you think that social institutions and libraries can play? I mean, those are specific things. But now as we are in a time of national crisis, just, with the pandemic, and why are libraries so important during these times?
Well, they've always been important in communities, and especially when communities are in need. And I know, and I've talked to a lot of my colleagues that feel very distressed that they have to physically be closed in many instances during a time that they know that the public would have been coming in, especially with virtual learning, with people needing information, all of the types of things that are going on. That's when libraries really are even more of a center. And so they have been doing things like loaning hotspots, loaning tablets, taking their mobile units and going into communities, especially rural areas, and being the Wi-Fi connection for communities, and carry out books and a lot of ebook checkouts and things like that. So it has been an extension of what Eric Kleinenberg said in his book, Palaces for the People, that really talked about libraries being part of the social infrastructure that needs to be protected. And when I got a chance to, and this was a thrill for me as a librarian, to interview Susan Orlean, the library book, at the Rancho Mirage Book Festival. And she talks about it using the Los Angeles Public Library as an example about how vital libraries are in communities.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that our staff here misses and that our patrons are missing is that community center aspect.
Sure.
Just seeing the faces every day and the short conversations you have with people, and you don't realize how much you miss that until you can't experience it. And
it's so important in communities because you have such a range of people, the young people, the seniors, everybody that's involved in the community. And this is one congresswoman even said, libraries are opportunity centers. That's what they really are.
Yeah.
So everybody has an opportunity to find a connection.
Well, speaking of connections, you just did the 20th annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. And can you tell us a little bit about what that festival is, how it got started, and then your decision to go ahead and host it and what that took this year in these interesting times?
The National Book Festival was the idea of an extension of an idea of First Lady Laura Bush. She had started the Texas Book Festival. It's one of the biggest and still continuing, when she was First Lady of Texas. And then when she arrived in Washington, my predecessor, Dr. James Billington, Librarian of Congress, they were having a conversation, and she said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have a national book festival similar to that? And my predecessor very wisely said yes. And so that's how it started about 20 years ago. And you hear people in the Washington area, it's become a Washington tradition. Physically, it was on the mall in Washington, D.C. at first, and then it grew and grew, and about 3 or so years ago, it was moved to the Washington Convention Center. And last year in 2019, 200,000 people in one day, and came to hear 120 authors and illustrators. It's hard to imagine that in the environment we're in now, 200,000 people, but it was a wonderful festival. So looking forward to the 20th year, we were planning all types of wonderful programming. And then, of course, by February of this year, it was apparent that having something in person might not be viable. Mm-hmm. And then by March, we knew. And so the decision was made to say, we've got to do something for the 20th anniversary. We can't let this pass because it's been so wonderful. And we moved to a virtual book festival, National Book Festival, that many of the people that are joining us now can still visit on the library's website and the National Book Festival website. And our multimedia team, who are helping me right now, switched gears, became the producers, and worked very hard. And we still had 120 authors and illustrators. And the wonderful feature of the virtual was that you can see the creators in their own environments. Mo Willems, the very popular
I know Mo Willems, my 4-year-old daughter.
Oh, he's a rock star.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
5 or under 6. That pigeon. Mm-hmm. He's working on a book, Pigeon Wears the Mask, or something like that. But you see him in his studio, and so you see authors, John Grisham, where they create, in their homes, in their studios, and that gives an extra dimension to it. So we're very pleased that we were able to have a broadcast partner and really work on it. So it became something that we're looking at the statistics now that has expanded beyond a Washington tradition and something that people could physically in the Washington area go to, but something that there's been participation from every state in this country and even overseas.
And it's all free, right? Anybody can take part.
It's all free. And it really gives you an opportunity to see the most popular authors, up-and-coming authors. We had several streams this year, Fearless Women, and also Black Voices. So there were ways that you could just tune in to certain authors or certain themes, or you could just surf around. So you had a lot of flexibility.
Libraries generally are a place for information, and we're in a day and age where we hear a lot about fake news or questionable information. I've always been really interested in media literacy. How come we don't teach kids from an early age, what a tabloid is versus a newspaper, or how to take in television? And now we have this whole social media thing. What role do you think libraries can play moving forward in helping people develop media literacy?
Well, libraries have been involved with what the term was called the information literacy for a number of years, and helping young people, especially in high school, later parts of high school, and definitely by the time if they went on to distinguish what's a good source for this information. And so that is continuing in the digital age. And so you will see more instances of libraries actually giving classes or having webinars on how do you tell the best source for whatever you need. We have a saying that's caught on, and we have t-shirts and mugs and bags that say librarians, the original search engines, because that's how we started. That was called reference.
Right.
We help the person get the answer to whatever the question they might have, help them formulate it, the question, so you can narrow in to what might help them.
Well, I think one of the things that's neat about having you as our Librarian of Congress is that you actually have that background as a librarian. You are also our first woman and our first African American in that position. What was it like to get that call that you'd been nominated? What do you remember about that day?
What I remember the most is thinking, what would I do to translate all my experiences as a librarian into something that will help really highlight what I knew as a librarian is the treasure of the Library of Congress, the world's largest library with, it's like the best. And so I said, okay, how can you bring all this together? And that was what was going through my mind. How could you do that? And then I really thought about all of the different experiences that I've had that might be helpful.
Jefferson once said, "I cannot live without books. Neither can we." The Library of Congress is our national treasure, and with Dr. Hayden at the helm, I know it is in excellent hands. Congratulations.
So that brings me to another question I was wondering about, is we were kind of thinking about the interview. Thank you again so much for your time. And we're talking about you. And I said to my coworker, it really struck me when we met last January, you had this sense of just calm and warmth about you. And I could tell your staff really respected you. And leaders can lead in all different kinds of ways, and they can be effective in all different kinds of ways. How did you develop that leadership style that you just seem like you're cool and calm under pressure, yet you just talked about that huge...
That's what you thought.
Yeah, but you talked about that huge responsibility, and I'm just curious, how did you develop your style of leadership over the years?
Well, I've had a lot of good role models and people who were mentors that have helped me, including my best role model, my mom, who worked in a number of, after she left the music field and went into human services, working for a housing department, working for the city planning, doing all of these, starting a shelter program for women in Chicago. I mean, she really was involved with boots on the ground. And part of it, and what she always emphasized, was that you're working with people. Everybody has their own backgrounds and things, and you respect them. The gentleman that is cleaning in the building on Sunday is just like Mr. Johnson, who is the deacon in the church that you go to. That these are people with full lives, and that's what you always have to remember and respect. So professional, and one of her favorites, professional is not a title. It's the way you perform any type of job. And so that, just knowing that, and knowing that we're all on a big journey together.
That's for sure.
There's stories. Everybody's got a story.
Speaking of stories, there's so many interesting things that you have a chance to look at. I remember talking to you about, you actually can go see the letters that Alexander Hamilton was writing to Eliza, and that, and these things that that become part of our national discussion at different times in history. But there was one story that I know you were involved with a photograph of Harriet Tubman.
Right.
And you got to work with the Smithsonian on this photograph and acquiring the photograph. Can you tell us about that?
And everyone can now see that letter because we're digitizing as much as we can. So the things, and that's been one of my major goals, is to make sure that some of these things that I've been able, very fortunate, and some of the people who come in person are able to see, that we are at least making them available digitally for people to look at. And so there's an opportunity to make sure that certain things remain in the public realm. And when the first known photograph of Harriet Tubman was being put up for auction, the Library of Congress and the then new National Museum of African American History and Culture went together, pooled our resources to purchase that photograph. And now when you see there's a motion picture about Harriet Tubman, at the end of it, there's a scene of her getting ready to pose, and it's based on that photograph, and then they actually show the photograph. It's in the public realm. It's been digitized, so it's physically on display now at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Library of Congress was involved with preserving it and conserving it and digitizing it. So you can go up and type in Harriet Tubman and you can download it and print it out for yourself.
I thought that was so fascinating because immediately I wanted to see that photo when I had read the interview where you were talking about that, and it totally changes. You know, I've seen that one picture that everyone's seen since I've been a little kid, much older, yes, and to see history in a new way in terms of just how I am thinking about things, it's so important. It's got to be a pretty rewarding feeling for you.
And that's what institutions like the Library of Congress, the National Archives, another partner that we have in the federal environment in terms of making history and culture available. We all know that history never stops, and so we're all going to be working together, but also giving that perspective that young people now that are hearing about Harriet Tubman can actually see a photograph of her and imagine that, yes, that woman in that photograph could have led hundreds of people through perilous conditions because she looks strong and she looks proud, and you could tell that that's the lady from the Underground Railroad.
So I know representation is an important thing to you, and in terms of how we're the artifacts that we keep, whose story we're telling, and who gets to tell this story. You've mentioned before that you had a favorite book when you were a youngster named called Bright April.
Bright April.
And that it had an impact on you because you saw yourself in that book for the first time. It wasn't just that window, it was actually...
It was a mirror, and that's what is often said about books for young people in particular, that they can be windows on the world. And you hear so many people talk about, they read a book about this, or they read a book about that, and it took them away, or they imagined different times. And what's so important, though, also, when we emphasize the importance of books and reading and literacy and things, if that's so important and you don't see yourself represented, then that's a not so subtle message that people are getting. You never see yourself in a book. You never see yourself represented in a film in an accurate way. You never get that opportunity. So for me, seeing a little girl that was about the same age, about 8, that had pigtails, that was brown, that was a brownie, not a Girl Scout, that had a family that was musical, and there was a little piano and the thing, and I thought, this is me. She was a lot cuter, but you aspire. But for me, it was close enough. that I just love that. And to this day, I can't look at that book without feeling a warm feeling.
Where do you think, as we wrap up, I'm curious, where do you think we continue to struggle most when it comes to representation? Who are those groups now that most need that mirror?
Oh, everybody needs it. Everybody needs to see themselves and be validated that my story, one, that there's a story that's similar to mine. And that's so important for young people to not feel alone, to be encouraged to tell their own stories. There's a sense of connection there. And so we have to keep encouraging young authors and writers and illustrators and giving them, and that's where libraries play such a big role. They are able, I mentioned Deborah Taylor, young adult librarian in Baltimore at the Pratt Library, who encouraged Jacqueline Woodson, Jason Reynolds, a lot of the names that you hear now. Deb Taylor encouraged them, had them do school talks, and brought them to Baltimore. So that's something that libraries need to continue to be right there and be part of making sure different voices are heard.
All right. Well, I have one last question for you. You're 4 years in to a 10-year term, and that can be renewed. So I'm curious if you have one or two biggest goals, and then are we going to see you beyond 2026 heading up the Library of Congress?
Well, as the more mature people say, Lord willing, that you'll be seen somewhere. But the goals that we're working on, and I'm working with such a great team, are centered around engaging more people with the collections of the library. Physically, we have some programs that we're working on for orientation center. That I mentioned that learning lab earlier, a treasures gallery of all of this cool stuff, and there's no one place where you can get a sense of the treasures. And then expanding our programming, letting people know that we have these things, and developing activity kits and just different things, especially for teachers. We've been doing a lot with teachers, especially now when they really need it with the virtual learning. So that's what, just extending the reach and connection of everyone to the Library of Congress.
Well, thank you so much for all that you do and that everyone does at the Library of Congress. And we so appreciate your time. Any last words for our viewers and listeners today?
Well, I'm looking forward to being back at Rancho Mirage, and especially for the book festival, because that was a pretty cool book festival too.
Well, we will have you anytime you would like to come. And thank you so much, Dr. Hayden.
Thank you.